Well, today I am joined by Michael Dewan-Herrick. And Michael, you're a psychotherapist living in the UK, American
Yes.
originally, and you have been, you were sharing with me that you have been working in counselor education, and you were doing
Mhm.
diversity training for a long time before it got super woke. So you have a deep perspective on this. And you've also been actively sharing some of your concerns around wokeness and psychotherapy on your YouTube channel. And so I think that that's really fascinating. And I'd love to hear more about that. And could you give a little bit of your background and kind of
Yeah,
flesh that out for us?
I'd be happy to. And first, and I said this before we turned on the recording, I just want to thank you for talking with me. And I've been appreciating your work for a while, and I may talk about it a little bit more later, but you're really the one that pushed me over the edge in terms of deciding to go ahead and speak out and put things on YouTube. So
Oh, wow. Well, thank you.
gratitude for that. I appreciate it. Um, as I said earlier to you, I've been in the field for over 40 years, so I have a very long path, and I have tried to narrow it down to the most formative parts of my path. And I think this will be useful for anybody who might be interested in checking out my channel to know what's informing what's going into it, right?
Mhm.
So I would dial back to 1976, excuse me, a 21-year-old young man, and I got interested in Buddhism and started studying and practicing in a Tibetan tradition back then, and wound up with my teacher was Chogyam Trungpa. Some people may have heard of this person who passed away in 87. But I took my refuge in Bodhisattva vows in, say, 79. And to just boil it down, there were two things that really were ingrained in me then. One was that from a Buddhist point of view, the whole idea of self and ego is a construction, and it's our attachment to it that causes suffering. And the other thing was that to be compassionate to all beings everywhere, all the time, everybody, even, any sentient being. So those two basic principles were planted in me early. Then I got interested in cultural anthropology, and I got a bachelor's degree in that from the University of Colorado in 1981. Very interested in especially indigenous cultures and how cultures work, what it takes to make a culture, how they're different, how they're the same. And then, since I was in Boulder, I became a mental health worker at a psychiatric hospital by fluke and got very fascinated in that. And there's a place called Naropa University. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's in Boulder, and it's a Buddhist inspired school, and they have then and still do a program in contemplative psychotherapy. So I enrolled in that program and graduated in 84. While I was studying at Naropa and working at a psych hospital, there was a clash in my mind between the Western model of psychology, which pretty much says that mental health issues have to do with the breakdown of ego, with having a weak ego, instead of seeing through it altogether. And I was trying to reconcile these things. And I came upon the work of Ken Wilber's integral theory. And that provided me for a way to hold both in mind, at the same time and integrate them. So let's see. I got married in 88. We moved to New England from Colorado. And we had two children. I have two grown children. My daughter and my son are both in their early 30s. And I think the experience of being married and having kids really challenged whatever kind of philosophical and spiritual bypassing I might have been doing up until then, right? It was real life on the ground, trying to provide for a family. So that was a big thing. I'll try to fast forward a little bit here, but I had a variety of clinical experiences when I moved to New England. And I won't name them all, but I just want to say that I was exposed to many different kinds of theories and modalities. And because I had begun to study the integral theory, I was able to hold them. I found a way to, make sense of them. And I was trying to think of a metaphor earlier. It's like, instead of integral psychotherapy being a competing therapy, it's more like a telescope you look through to see the constellations, in the sky. And each modality and each theory is like a constellation. And so they all have a place. All right, so let's move it forward a little bit. So I moved here. I have a 14-year-old daughter with my wife that I married when I moved here to the UK 15 years ago. And I worked as a tutor for 10 years at a place called the Minster Centre, which is a training school for integrative psychotherapists. It's affiliated with Middlesex University in London. And one of the roles I had there was to teach a diversity module from, say, 2012 to 2017. And that was a bit of a fluke that I got that job. Looking, even at the time, but especially now looking back, I have a white, cis, heterosexual male teaching a diversity module. I don't think this happens anymore, but somehow I got the job. And woke was starting to, creep in. I think they had to come up with a diversity module. That was part of what was being required, but I don't think they knew much about what that would entail. And I wasn't given a whole lot of guidance about it, but a lot of freedom. So I created my own curriculum. And I used principles of integral theory to design it.
I'm really curious about integral theory as you're talking about it. Sounds like it helped you to pull, and thank you for providing that context for your background. And as you got to where you were, it sounds like you had a variety of different experiences and exposures to ways of thinking about what it means to be a human being. And this integral theory really helped you to, as you say, hold all of those and be able to contain them. And so one of my experiences in graduate school was that I felt like I was being taught in one way, sort of a basically a broadly person-centered way, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, there was this woke layer that was being added on, which was absolutely contradictory. And there was no attempt to make both merge. And I kind of don't want them to merge because I'm so alarmed by the reductionist woke view. But, as you're talking, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about these two opposing ideas. So would you mind saying a little bit more about integral theory?
Sure. Probably a good place to start is to talk about what integral theory calls the four quadrants. And these are four kind of basic lenses to look through and four areas for practice. They're built on two opposites, the interior and the exterior, and the individual and the collective. And I've boiled this down to a simpler language, which is it has to do with the mind, the body, relationships or social life, interpersonal things, intersubjective things, and the environment, right? So early in my career, I was introduced to the biopsychosocial model, and it's very similar to that, right? So one of my videos, I talk about the different, I don't call them the waves of psychotherapy. I think that's a common way that people talk about it, the different waves. But there's a way that we can identify that each kind of modality fits into one of these four areas, focuses on that primarily. For instance, psychoanalytic thought is mostly about mind, but behaviorism and the medical model in terms of psychiatry is more about the body. And more recently, we have body-oriented psychotherapies. And then family systems theory and working with groups and with families is more about the intersubjective dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And so the one that hadn't been developed fully, I don't think, until woke came along, is the environment. In terms of institutions, in terms of economics and social realities outside of the family.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where it fits.
That's
But
really interesting. Yeah.
The problem along the way, and this is what integral theory points out, and I also want to mention that I've recently finished reading Cynical Therapies, and Val Thomas contributed to it and edited it, and I noticed her first end note in the chapter she wrote was about integral theory, and she recognized through that there's a reductionism. Each new therapy that comes along tends to want to reduce everything to its quadrant, and they want to reduce everything to this social dimension. So that's and so when I designed the course, I used the quadrants. I used them in terms of, and by the way, my premise in the course was diversity meant difference, human difference, and how that is significant in therapy. As time went on, I noticed that diversity didn't mean that to those who were talking about it. It meant race and gender and sex. It was reduced to a few categories. Whereas I started my classes by pointing out the quadrants and saying, what is different about people psychologically? What is different about people physically? What is different about people culturally and socially? What is different about the environments they inhabit? But then the other important thing that I feel I added, which is missing from woke, is human universals. Right? How are we the same? So we're endlessly different, but we're endlessly the same as well. And so also use the quadrants to identify how human beings share so much in terms of
I get
body
a pang of relief when I hear you say that. I just wish that had been taught that way when I was in school. It was so alarming the way that we were cutting things along these really crude demographic lines. It's
so cookie cutter. It's so simplified. It jettisons so much of what it means to be a human being, and then it sets us up to be in division and conflict and competition all the time, and resentment and shame, all the rest of it. I mean, the kinds of things I've heard you talk about on your channel. So I had that opportunity for 5 years, and it was a 3-hour-long class, and most weeks I taught 2 or 3 different classes each week for 5 years, and I read hundreds of student essays. And what was interesting was that when I was doing the class, the seminar papers there was a great range. Some of it had to do with race or sexual preference, but sometimes it was about childlessness or having ADHD or being short or having red hair, or there were all kinds of ways that people are different, and all kinds of unexpected ways that can be significant in therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned a lot from students, but at some point, probably be useful to say, well, so what got me upset enough to speak out? And one of my early experiences was actually in this class. I had a student who was doing a seminar presentation that she developed about British identity or British culture. And she lived in a small town in the UK and noticed over 20 years' time with an immigrant population coming in that the whole culture seemed to feel different. Mm-hmm. And she was just talking about how that felt. And she was, raising the question, what is British culture? What is British identity? What does it mean to feel that your culture is changing? Which I thought was a perfectly fine thing to talk about. But the reaction that she got from her classmates was very hostile.
It's like she stepped into something that was untouchable.
Yeah. You can't, to have pride or attachment or anything about your national identity or your own, white culture was, wrong. And she was quite taken aback. And I was so taken aback. In retrospect, I wished I'd done a better job at managing the class and protected her a bit, but it took me
you didn't see it coming.
No, I didn't see it coming, and I've had a few other more personal experiences that I didn't see coming. I think it was around 2016 or 17 that I put a post on my Facebook page kind of challenging the idea of white privilege. And I thought, well, this is going to be a little controversial, maybe, somebody's not going to agree with this. But I found two of my closest friends for years, one I've known since high school, and my own brother just went on the attack and pretty much disowned me just for raising this. And it was like, whoa, where did that come from? I really, until then, I didn't realize how intense this was and what kind of pushback you get for just raising a question or challenging an idea. There's another thing that I want to mention, just in terms of what motivated me to do this and what has informed me a little bit further is in 2021, I was diagnosed with colon cancer, stage 3C, and went through surgery and went on chemotherapy, and I had a 30% probability of survival. Just to get to the point, I'm alive. I'm cancer-free now. I had a test done that suggests I have a very low probability that it'll return, so that's good. But it really had an impact. I came out of that, and it was shortly after coming off the chemo that I started my channel on YouTube, and I never really thought I could do that. I heard you say once upon a time that you yourself didn't really think of yourself as a YouTube person or somebody who'd record videos, and so I didn't either. It took me a while to work it up, but I thought, life is short. Who knows when it's going to end? I can't hold back. I want to offer something,
So that experience of illness and sort of a facing death,
right,
clarified some things for you and made you less afraid to say what you think.
Yeah, and it made me go, what do I have to offer? What do I need to give before I'm gone? And then it was in July that I decided to do my first video, and the title of the series that I've created is called Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. And again, this was, you pushed me over the edge on this. I had been following Jodi Shaw also, and been hearing a lot of other people talk, from Coleman Hughes to Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter to Jordan Peterson to James Lindsay and Benjamin Boyce. Oh, by the way, my grown daughter went to Evergreen. She graduated before the whole thing happened, but I was quite keen to follow that, given that she had gone there. Anyway, so I in July, I started this channel to not just offer, the channel itself is on personal development, right? But there's this subset of it, which is about questioning woke psychotherapy. And I thought, this is where I really need to stick my neck out. I need to tell the truth, as I see it.
Well, that sounds like a really needed thing right now. There are so many people who are kind of realizing that their therapy experiences have been really harmful for them because of this ideology.
Well, yeah. And we're, as I know that you're aware, we're going to be seeing more of this in the future, particularly around transgender issues and detransitioning. And I think in 10 years from now, we're going to need a whole army of therapists prepared to work with these people.
And I think we're going to need a parallel profession, because my fear is that at least the last several years, the cohorts that are coming out of the schools have been so indoctrinated in this way of thinking that it's changed what a therapist is fundamentally. It's like it still has the same word, it still has the same label, but the definition has changed. And
they're being turned into activists now.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's the thing. Not only has woke decided to reduce everything to its own particular quadrant, but it has changed the basic intention of therapy.
Yeah, explicitly.
I mean, it was a little under the radar at first, but now it's explicit. Yeah.
When you were teaching diversity, did you feel was there a pressure that you felt to change how you were teaching as time went on, or was it still before things became so explicit?
Well, I think people didn't know exactly what I was doing. I was just kind of left to it. I increasingly toward the end of it, before I gave it up, I felt that if I was really explicit, that there would have been questions.
Okay. In what way? What do you mean by that?
Well, what about intersectionality? What about white privilege? What about Robin DeAngelo? What about, focusing more on race?
So those things were starting to be in your awareness, and that was you were starting to be aware that was an expectation of a diversity course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were you just sort of sidestepping that at the time and trying to avoid getting into that confrontation over pedagogy?
Yeah, pretty much. I didn't feel any really hot breath on my shoulder about it, but I was aware, that I wasn't following the usual, what was developing to be, what it should be. And, I was replaced by a person of color who had much more of the kind of critical race theory approach. And I think the module took a complete turn at that point.
When you describe that, the student who spoke about what it means to be a British person, what does it mean to be of this culture? and the way that the class responded to her. I guess I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about that mental social process that seems to be activated, and we seem to be seeing it in lots of different areas right now. You can call it cancel culture, you can call it mobbing, whatever it is, but it's this very passionate indignation and swift like social reprobation that's just being poured onto the subject of whatever it is. If you said the wrong thing, did you say, like you experienced with your posts that your friends and your brother responded to, that same process? It seems like it's not just on the left, it's everywhere. I just experienced it because I tried to voice some moderate opinions about a man in a dress, and I'm watching this activation happen.
I listened to that, by the way. I think that's very interesting.
It is
the
interesting.
man in the blue dress at the Senspec.
Yeah.
No, I heard you talking about that.
Yeah.
And you got some blowback. Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's interesting. Like, I'm just kind of watching it happen, and I'm thinking, this looks like I'm watching the same process of activation, but so it's not confined to some political party or anything. I mean, that's just silly to even think that it would be. But what are your thoughts about that process of social activation that we see?
Well, it's complex. I mean, the first thought I had was Douglas Murray's
Madness of
book,
Crowds.
Madness of Crowds and War on the West. That we've had kind of a pervasive, maybe it started with Howard Zinn's, take on history, but in the Western culture, we've become ashamed of ourselves, for our slavery, for our colonization, and we can't take any pride in our heritage. It's really, if you even make a peep about it, then you're a far right white supremacist, and we are all anyway, right? I think it has to do with wanting to be on the right side of the moral equation, and being afraid that you're going to be caught out. This thing about the man in the blue dress, though, really got me to thinking that on this side of it, the challenging to the woke, I think we need to be careful, because we could be creating our own tribe, and coming up with all the same canceling kind of bullshit that we're calling out, and that's why this is a bit of a segue, but I want to make sure I say this about my channel, and what I'm trying to do with it. I have three intentions. One is to provide a robust critique, right? And I'm saying a lot of the things that I hear other people saying, but I think I have a unique voice and some perspectives to add to it. But I also want to preserve what is true and what the good intentions are that are coming from the woke. I think that we need to acknowledge that. And I also want to provide an alternative, right? I don't think it's going to be effective to just go, oh, this is crazy, let's get rid of it and go back to the way it used to be. I think we have to digest it, right? Kind of distill what's useful in it, what's true in it, and allow that to inform our way forward. I think we're going to have to digest it. And this is a principle in integral theory, which is basically called transcend and include. It's a developmental process. You don't just, get rid of something, you include it, but you integrate it in a new form.
So in terms of the woke, what do you think? What are your thoughts on if you cut through the process of how things are being pushed and the way that the things that are so harsh and bullying and
Right.
there's a process and then there's the content. So what is
Right.
worth keeping?
Right. Well, on the intention level, from a moral perspective, I think there's a good moral impulse. It doesn't like injustice. It doesn't like inequality.
Mhm.
It wants to challenge that. It wants society to be fair. It doesn't want people to be treated badly, right? I think that's worth keeping. I think there postmodernism in terms of the what's true or what's intellectually useful. I think postmodernism in its extreme forms is really destructive and nihilistic,
Mhm.
but it does point out how we construct meaning, and it does point out that certain forms of discourse can be oppressive. So I think there's a value there,
Mhm.
but it's exaggerated, and this whole dividing everything into the oppressed and the oppressor, where everything has to be kind of you belong to either one or the other group. And even with the complexity of intersectional theory, you still wind up in the same place, just a hierarchy of the same thing. I think that's where it goes wrong. That's where what needs to be called out. But, some of the ideas and the basic moral impulse, I think, are worth keeping. And I think if that can be a part of what we're doing in challenging woke, it'll be potentially more persuasive to those who may have reservations and want to preserve their moral impulse, but in a more effective way. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it does make sense. It makes a lot of sense, and I think that it's refreshing to hear that. I think that there's there's so much that's so divisive and hurt, and I don't want to use the word hurtful because it sounds like the woke language, like we're
Right.
sometimes it's hard not to frame things the way that they frame it, but there's so much that's I think that families have been hurt, families, their friends have been separated. There's this process of calling things out in this categorical way, oppressor versus oppressed, has been really destructive.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so I think that there's a natural um tendency to want to reject all of it. But sometimes some of the parts that I hear being rejected are even we hear a lot of people mocking the concept of empathy and compassion. Like it's an overgrowth of compassion, it's empathy. And so these kind of there's such a wholesale rejection of this that I think that you could
Uh-huh.
throw the baby out with the bathwater and throw away
Right.
things that are
Yeah.
not part of the process that you're really objecting to, but rather are just human elements that have been hijacked or have been sort of like, if you think about the Aristotelian virtues, where the dearth of something and the excess of something are both um
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
problematic expression, and what you want
Exactly.
is something that's in the middle. So you want something that's
Right.
on in the balance.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, I agree. And that's what I'm attempting to do with my channel. And I struggle a bit sometimes finding the right balance. Sometimes I get angry and really fed up, and I think it's just insane stuff, you know.
Mhm.
Then I have to take a breath and go, okay, wait a minute,
Mhm. Mhm.
what's a more measured way to respond to this? And then sometimes I get too measured, right? And I don't put as fine a point on it as it might need. So
Mhm.
I'm kind of learning this stance as I go along.
What is the content of your videos and the do you do like, are they like 20-minute videos, hour long, and are they on different topics or?
Yeah, different topics. Anywhere. I may have a few 10 or 12-minute long, but mostly they're 20-minute,
Okay.
30-minute
Okay, so
long.
really digestible.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I started by talking about my first one of my first after the initial one. My first one was on diversity,
Mhm.
and I called it Fumbling Diversity, and it was saying diversity isn't diverse enough, right?
Yeah.
This is what real diversity would be, right?
Mhm.
And my next one is about human universals. So talk about that. Um, I made a list somewhere of the titles of my videos, but I had one titled Propaganda, where I examined how woke goes about spreading its message and the kinds of deceptive uh, ways that they use language. You know, the Trojan horse of, you know, putting a nice name on something like gender affirming care.
Mhm. Mhm.
Sounds nice, you
Yeah.
know, but it's not really.
Mhm.
Um, I did two on politics and psychotherapy. I made reference to that earlier. Um, just challenging the whole activism stance for
Mhm.
therapy.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I'm just trying to, you know, what did I do? One on um, disparities in personal responsibility, one on victim mentality, just trying to take different elements of what woke is promoting
Mhm.
and going, let's take a look at that. What's
Mhm.
that really about?
Oh, that sounds so useful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then where I can, I say, here's an alternative. You know, I have one. I have one that's on can we have a civil discourse? You know,
Mhm.
and propose a way to do that. I also shared a supervision format that I learned when I
Mhm.
studied at Naropa
Mhm.
that uses the four quadrants basically, and as a as a way to think of clinical work, but also a way to approach supervision, and also as a way for supervisors to um, pay attention to all four quadrants,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
That sounds like a very useful framework in a lot of ways.
yeah.
Can you do you want to dive into one topic and give some of your insights on it? Any one particular thing that comes up that you think is um particularly relevant?
Hmm. Good question. Well, this is what's coming to mind. I did one fairly recently on morality and ethics.
Morality and ethics.
Morality and ethics in terms of questioning woke psychotherapy. And I elaborated a little bit more on what I said a few minutes ago about the moral impulse, you know, that there is, you know, a good moral impulse, but that it gets distorted. And I bring in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations to talk about different moral impulses. I talk about Lawrence Kohlberg's developmental model and point out that this positive moral impulse gets kind of stuck at what Kohlberg would call the conventional stage, which is where you're trying to follow the rules and be part of your tribe and you know, conform to what's expected, what the orthodoxy is, and that this moral impulse gets a bit frozen
Mm.
in the woke ideology. and that the post-conventional stage, according to Kohlberg, is when you begin to examine the conventional stage. You begin to have a little bit more of an autonomous ability to judge moral questions based on principles, on higher principles. And that means sometimes you act morally by not doing or agreeing with the conventions. And I like to think that that's what I'm attempting to do. That's what you're attempting to do. You know, you have principles, you know, that you're not willing to adopt this conventional model and subscribe to everything you're supposed to say and do and think and feel. So that's one of my recent videos was on that.
Well, that sounds fascinating. And I have not yet gone to your channel and watched, but I would like to. I think I will go over and see what your insights are. So thank you for sharing that. And if you have, I'm sure you probably sent me the link, but if not, we'll put the link in the description. Either way, so people can follow that. Do you want to tell the name of your channel as well?
It's called
people who are listening?
Sure, Attention Bazaar.
Attention Bazaar.
Or I think you can find it just by using my name, Michael Dewan-Herrick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are we doing for time? Are we good?
Yeah, we're good. We're good. It's a good time. We can, if you have anything else you want to go into, we have a few more minutes we could do, or we could wrap. I'm kind of curious as to what unless you had something else, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about are you optimistic about the future in regards to this issue?
Yeah, great question. Yes and no. I was thinking, what might I say if you asked me such a question? And I'm optimistic in the sense that I think ultimately this whole thing is going to collapse on itself. It's going to prove itself to be a failure, and we'll look back on it. That's my hope. I think that will happen, and there'll be casualties along the way. But I think that there's a growing number of people challenging it now, and I think that we need to. Val Thomas, I don't know if you have read Cynical Psychotherapy or Cynical Therapies, but she says if we can just make a place for this form of therapy, and have it be
social justice therapy.
Yeah, it's got its own little thing. Maybe we could do that. Maybe we could do that. I think we need to get the accrediting bodies to agree not to force it down everybody's throat. Right?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. I've thought that it would be, what's alarming is these students coming out of programs, people will say, oh, well, Antioch is an extreme example. Their curriculum is more woke than other programs. And I don't know if that's true or not. I suspect that to some extent it is true, but I don't think that they're alone in that. But the thing is that they come out of there without any kind of special designation. So it's not as though you see this person gets some extra letter after their name that designates them as a social justice therapist. Once they're licensed, they're just a therapist like anybody else. And I think that it's dangerous to have, whether that constitutes 20% of the field or 100% of the graduates, it's still dangerous to have them at large espousing things that are under the cover of a label, but no longer representative of that label. And unwitting consumers are still going into this process and getting a very different service.
Yeah. Are you hopeful? Where we're going? Do you think we're going to come out of this?
The profession or the culture? because I
Good
think it's two
question.
different
Yeah, no,
things.
that's a very good point. And yeah, psychotherapy is only one little part of this
Uh,
whole problem.
yeah.
So
Well, I
yeah, I
think
don't
there's
know.
kind of the trifecta of cultural, um, I guess, soldiers in this. There's the medical angle, there's the educational, and then there's the psychological. And so I think right now all three of these are really fraught with a lot of ideology, and these are institutions which are going to be big ships that are hard to turn around. And so I think it's going to be a long time before there's a significant progress on those angles. But in the meantime, the more people become aware of that, the
Uh,
more consumer pressure gets put on that
right.
by consumers flocking to alternatives. And there are
Yeah.
alternatives. So there are alternative educational models. There are people forming their own homeschool groups, charter schools, etc. There's ways to avoid that. There's autodidacts that are realizing that they didn't need to go to university to learn what they needed to learn. There's trade schools, etc. So there's alternatives to the educational institutions. There's
Yeah, yeah.
alternatives to the medical institution to a great extent, unless you need an emergency. If you need something really emergently, you're stuck with
Uh,
mainstream medicine.
uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
then psychology, again, I think that the applied psychology field hasn't served the people that it considers the worried well very well for a long time. I think that young, new emerging counselors, especially, are just being funneled into or pushed into community mental health and working with people who are profoundly afflicted
Uh-huh.
with addiction or mental illness, and they're not being equipped to respect and care for people who have increasing, as this profession has increasingly become destigmatized, and more people want to use counseling to cope with the stresses and the difficulties of life. At that same time, counselors are being trained to disdain these people and to look down on them and to diagnose them. And I definitely saw that in my program, where
Uh,
we're using a diagnostic medical model to label people who may be just suffering from grief or some kind of developmental process that's normal in their life for them.
yeah.
So I think that there are alternatives to that as well, and that the coaching field, hopefully we can see.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of good psychologists and counselors move into parallel practice where they're also offering coaching, which is a lot more peer-to-peer. And I think it's a lot more helpful for people who are not profoundly mentally ill. So
Absolutely.
I think as we flock to the alternatives, we'll put pressure on the institutions, and that will eventually create some shift. But I guess that's my
It's going to
optimistic
take
answer.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm also a coach. I'm a
Oh,
psychotherapist and a life coach.
are
And
you
I
offering
understand.
services now?
You mean right now?
No, no. Yeah.
Whoever's
Yes,
watching.
please. Yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah,
is that a thing that you want to promote? Like, do you want people to go to a website to find your services, or?
sure. I
Okay.
could
Okay.
give you a link to my
Okay.
my website. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Um, but in terms of the additional educational opportunities and alternatives, as I'm getting older, and as you've recognized the new wave of therapists coming into the field, I feel like it's really important for me to share. I need to, while some of us older folks who've been in the field for a long time are still around, I think we need to speak up. We need to say this is what therapy has been, and let's
Yeah.
not forget it.
I have this hope that we we can, I don't know who we is. I keep being very reluctant to take this on myself because I feel over extended right now, but I want someone to form an alternative parallel association, sort of a philosophical counseling association that's not medically based, that can sort of offer a counterpoint to the overly diagnostic and medicalized, sort of bureaucratic. It's almost like the way that counselors are being trained right now. They're technicians plugging in
Right.
codes. And so
Well,
something that's more existential, philosophical, something that's more not not based in this model and
Yeah,
serves
yeah,
the average person to whom, you know, counseling has become a normal,
yeah.
expected part of life that you can avail yourself of.
Well, right.
But we need
Diagnose.
educators who will educate within that,
Right.
because
Well,
I think that I keep on cutting you off. Sorry.
that's all right. No, I have
Yeah.
a lot to say.
Yeah, no, I do. I think that my concern is that these students right now, if you want a counseling education, you have to get a giant serving of woke with it. And that causes a lot of difficulty for people, because it's really an abusive ideology. And so you have to run this gauntlet
Right.
of woke education in order to come out the other end with counseling
Right.
counseling
And
foundations.
yeah,
Mhm.
and interesting to juxtapose that to the kind of over diagnosing and pathologizing of, human turmoil, human trouble,
Right.
grieving, and developmental things,
Mhm.
to have to diagnose it.
Yeah.
That's a whole kind of oppressive system in itself. And this is what I really appreciated about my training at Naropa, which was, it was more about human problems. It wasn't about diagnosing people. And my work with Windhorse Integrative Mental Health Services is a model that really took that to heart, and we didn't really diagnose people. We saw them as people who were struggling, and we tried to have the most intimate while professional relationship with them that we could, creating households and having teams of people spend time with them in the home, in the community, people who struggling with psychosis or some other major mental illness. And these models are out there, but they're not, taught enough.
Mhm. Yeah, well, that sounds like a breath of fresh air again.
Yeah, and you might include a link to Windhorse, in the dis- description for this, if anybody wants to check that out.
Absolutely. Please send me any links that are relevant to this discussion, and I'll be happy to put them
Okay,
in the
right.
the description. Will you tell people again where to find you?
Um, it's a story that I don't have time to tell right now, but it's called Attention Bazaar, or just Michael Dewan-Herrick, and I can provide a link to my channel so people can find it that way. And the other thing that we don't have time to talk about, but I want to mention it. I'm. This is wonderful to talk to you. I'm thrilled to have this conversation, and I haven't had enough of these conversations. And I really like to be more networked and more connected to other people. I'm talking to people who share similar views. I mean, I I also supervise clinicians, and some of them are in training right now or have been. And part of what they bring to supervision is all this woke stuff that they're trying to navigate.
Mhm.
Um, so I've had people that I talk to, but those who, like yourself, um, I'm hoping that in time I can become more networked and connected, and perhaps interview people myself at some point.
Mm-hmm. It's really great to speak with people who see this issue similarly, because it's very clarifying, and it's an area where there's so much. It's the cultural, I guess, gaslighting is the most succinct word for it, but it really does a number on you to have to navigate that. So I agree. I think it's really important to establish um, a group of people as a sort of your own cultural reference point, your own sort of tribe, I guess, if you will.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
for me, finding CTA was really important. That was an important thing
Yeah,
for me. So if you
very,
haven't
very
gotten
repetitive.
in
Yeah,
touch
yeah,
with
no.
them, okay.
Well, I follow their content, but I haven't actually communicated. So maybe
Yeah,
I
you
will.
can join, and there's members meetings, and so it's
Okay.
really
Uh-huh.
it's that was a lifeline to me when I was a student and struggling to understand what the heck was going on. And it sounds like the content that you're putting out, I think when I was a student, I would have been overjoyed to find that as well,
Okay.
because
All right.
it's actually illuminating what's going on for people and describing how it's harmful and describing what the alternatives should look like. So
Right.
I think
Right.
that was when I found an essay by Val Thomas on new discourses,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and
Uh-huh.
it was like a beacon for me. Here's somebody who's
Mhm.
describing what I'm experiencing, and she's articulating it so well. And through reading how she was writing about this, I guess I don't remember what it was entitled, but it was something like wokeness in psychotherapy, something along those lines. Um, it it really it helped me to understand my own thoughts that I was struggling to articulate even to myself.
That must have been, yeah. And I did watch your early videos on this, and it really had a lot of empathy for what you were going through, and the decisions you had to make, and how you've managed to create a professional working life despite all of that. So,
Parallels.
yeah, I do. If we're about to end, I just wanted to maybe end on a positive note.
Okay.
Something that came through my email this week was from UKCP, United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, and they have recently made a statement about gender affirming care,
Mm.
and said that exploratory therapy should not be considered to be conversion
Conversion
therapy,
therapy. Good.
and that
Excellent.
everybody, that it should be a right to not have to believe that men can be women and women can be men. So I was really, really, because that's my accrediting body, and they've actually come out and made a statement, and I was so happy, it almost made me cry, just saying, oh my God,
The sanity.
the sanity, this accrediting body that has a lot of power and can influence so many people, has made this statement. It was just really a positive thing that came through this week.
Really
Yeah,
good to hear. It's
yeah.
very good. I hope the US is not so far behind. They are right now, but I hope we can see some of that. It seems like it's going the wrong direction here.
No,
But
yeah.
we'll see. We'll see. Well, hopefully, I
Well,
don't want to take your positive
yeah.
note and
No, well, I'm not
drag
living
it.
in the States anymore, but I'm following it. And yeah, it sounds horrible. We have the Tavistock clinic here that was doing the gender conversion, and they got shut down, So yeah, you're probably aware of that, all of that business,
Yeah, I'm aware. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Well, lots of movement over there. Hopefully we can start taking some steps in that direction.
Well, the UK tends to copy the US. Maybe it can go the other way sometimes.
That would be nice. Well, thank you for speaking with me today and sharing.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
It's been great to talk with you. And I'll again look in the notes under this for links.
All right. If there's anything you can't find and you still need, let me know, but I'll send you a few
Okay.
links.
Sounds
Okay.
great.